Blackthorn Manor had stood in the hills of Yorkshire for nearly 3 centuries. Built from stone that weathered time like bone, it cast long shadows even at noon. No villagers dared approach it. Not anymore. They said the manor chose who to let in, and even fewer who could leave. In the autumn of 1982, Arthur Langley, a London historian, inherited the manor from a distant uncle he had never met. The will arrived without ceremony, just a letter, a key, and a warning. Never open the east wing. Let her sleep. Arthur, of course, ignored the last line. He was a man of logic, a man of books and reason. Ghost stories were for children and fading minds. The manor, to him, was nothing more than an old estate in need of cataloguing, maybe restoration. The housekeeper, Mrs. Renfield, had stayed behind to care for the place. She was thin, pale, and always looked over her shoulder, especially near dusk. "She doesn't like guests," Mrs. Renfield said once, as she handed Arthur his tea. He smiled politely. "Who's she?" The woman didn't answer. But every night, Arthur heard footsteps in the east wing. Heavy, slow, measured, even though the doors were locked. Even though he had the only key. On the 7th day, he decided to enter. The corridor beyond the east wing door was thick with dust. Curtains hung in tatters. Paint peeled from the walls like dead skin. But the air was not cold. It was warm, as though something still lived there. At the end of the hallway stood a door painted black, with iron knobs and a brass nameplate tarnished by time. Arthur wiped it clean. It read, Lillian Wetherell, 1792. He opened the door. The room inside was untouched by age. A vanity with a cracked mirror. A wedding dress on a mannequin. A pair of shoes beneath the bed, still polished. And beside the fireplace, in an old wooden rocking chair, someone sat. She wore a veil. And though her bones should have turned to dust long ago, her chest rose with breath. The chair creaked once. Then the voice, dry as paper, broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come." Arthur Langley did not run. Not at first. The figure in the chair remained still, save for the slow, rhythmic creaking of wood. He stepped closer, half convinced it was a mannequin, some grotesque joke or display from an ancestor with poor taste. But then she breathed. Beneath the veil, her chest rose. Deliberately. Too slow to be natural. The air in the room pressed in on him, thick and hot like breath on the back of his neck. He cleared his throat. "Madam, this wing was sealed. I didn't think." "You thought wrong," she whispered. Arthur backed toward the door, but it had closed on its own. He turned the knob. Locked. Behind him, the veil stirred. "I waited," she said. "He never came back." Arthur turned slowly. "Who?" Her head tilted, the veil shifting just enough to reveal the curve of her jaw, gray, dry, like old parchment. Her voice cracked with something older than sorrow. "My groom." The mirror behind her flickered. Arthur glanced at it, and saw her reflection standing behind him. Not sitting. Standing. He whirled around. The chair was empty. The veil lay draped over the backrest. The room was silent, but the mirror still showed her standing, tall, skeletal, in the gown, hands clasped, head tilted. She raised one finger in the reflection and pointed, not at Arthur, at the door. The lock clicked. He fled. Back through the east wing, across the dusty hall, slamming the door behind him. He turned the key, but when he looked down, The brass nameplate from her door was in his hand. He hadn't taken it. He never touched it. It had come with him. He dropped it, heart pounding. And from the east wing, far down the hall, the sound of the rocking chair resumed. Creak, creak, creak. That night, Arthur dreamed of the dress. It hung in the center of the manor's great hall, swaying gently on an invisible breeze. The fabric was white once, now yellowed, the hem crusted with something dark. Blood, perhaps. Or soil. He couldn't tell. The mannequin beneath the gown had no head, but the veil floated above it anyway. When he awoke, his bedsheets were wet. Not with sweat. With cold water. As if he had been submerged. Downstairs, the fire in the drawing room was already lit. Mrs. Renfield stood before it, her back stiff. Arthur entered, and she spoke before he could. She wore the gown until the end, she said. Even after he left her at the altar. Even after the bells stopped. Arthur sat down slowly. She locked herself in that room for days. Refused food. Refused the priest. When they finally broke down the door, Mrs. Renfield turned. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red. The room was empty, but the chair rocked. And it hasn't stopped. Arthur hesitated. But I saw her. Mrs. Renfield shook her head. No, Mr. Langley. What you saw was her memory. She is not alive. But she is not gone, either. That's what a widow's grief does, in a place like this. He didn't sleep the next night. The gown haunted every corner of the manor. Sometimes in mirrors. Sometimes at the end of corridors that used to be empty. Sometimes on the second-floor landing. Just standing. Waiting. He tried to ignore it. But on the fifth day, the bell rang. The chapel bell. It hadn't rung in decades. Its rope was snapped. The bell tower condemned. But it rang. Once. Long and low. Arthur ran to the window. The sky was gray, the manor grounds wrapped in mist. At the base of the bell tower, a woman stood. Still in the dress. Still veiled. But now, she looked up. Right at him. The chapel had been sealed since 1911. After the war, after the fire, after the vicar was found kneeling at the altar with no eyes and a mouth sewn shut. They never reopened it. Never rebuilt. But now, its door was ajar. Arthur approached slowly. The morning fog clung to the gravestones like fingers. The iron gate screeched behind him, though he hadn't touched it. The air was thick with the scent of burned incense, long expired. The chapel loomed before him, its bell tower crumbling, its stained glass cracked. And yet, the veil was draped across the threshold. He bent to touch it, cold, damp, fresh. Inside, the pews were coated in dust and cobwebs, untouched for decades. But the aisle had been cleared, a straight path of clean stone, leading to the altar. And at the altar, a figure knelt, still, silent. The widow. She did not move as Arthur approached. He called to her. Lillian. She flinched, only slightly, then stood, and turned. Her face, still veiled, was closer now. Beneath the fabric, he saw movement, eyes shifting. A twitch of lips that hadn't spoken in a century. Her voice came as a whisper and a breath. He never came back. Arthur stepped closer. Who was he? The veil rustled. The chapel darkened, though no clouds passed. He promised, she said. He stood here, with me, and he promised. Behind the altar, the stained glass shattered. A gust of wind blew inward. It carried whispers, Latin, perhaps, or some forgotten prayer. The veil flew from her face. Arthur froze. What lay beneath was not decay. It was emptiness. No eyes, no mouth, no skin, only void, only grief made form. And yet it looked at him. "You carry his blood," she said. "You opened the door." Arthur stumbled back. "I didn't know. You woke me." The bell tolled again. Once, twice. The doors slammed shut, and the shadows in the pews began to move. Figures, dozens of them, wearing torn wedding clothes. Faces blank, mouths sewn, watching him, waiting. Arthur could not move. The chapel walls seemed to press inward, heavy with silence. The air turned colder with each breath, but sweat clung to his skin. The pews groaned as the figures slowly stood, men and women in decaying wedding attire, each with hollow faces and mouths sewn shut. They didn't approach. They simply turned, toward the altar, toward her, the widow of Blackthorn Manor, Lillian. She raised one hand, and the veil that had flown from her face now hovered in the air, drifting back toward her like it belonged. As it covered her face once more, the bell tolled again, 3 times. She turned to Arthur, her voice now deeper, more than grief. It was command. "You will stand where he stood." "No," Arthur whispered. "I'm not him. I'm not the man who left you." But Lillian stepped down from the altar. Her feet did not touch the ground. "You bear his blood. That is enough." Arthur backed away, toward the chapel doors. They remained shut, unmoving, cold as stone. Behind him, the windows turned black, no longer showing sky, only shifting shadows. The congregation began to hum, low, droning, like a song long forgotten, and the chapel shifted. The decay faded. For a moment, Arthur stood not in ruins, but in a chapel restored. Fresh flowers lined the aisle. Candles burned. The scent of lilies filled the air. And before him, Lillian, young again, beautiful, smiling. She held out her hand. "Say the vow," she whispered. But Arthur saw something move beneath her skin, something that twitched, that crawled. The vision shattered. He stumbled back. The illusion gone. Only rot remained. And then, the congregation turned to him. One by one, they opened their mouths, threads snapping, skin splitting. But no screams came. Only one word. "Stay." The shadows surged forward. Arthur ran. The chapel doors flung open just as he reached them. Wind howled through the graveyard. The veil chased him, dragging across the stones, reaching like fingers. He didn't stop until the manor's front doors slammed behind him. Inside, the ticking of the grandfather clock echoed loud and fast. But it had no hands. Where the clock face should be, only a mirror. And in the reflection, Lillian, standing behind him, smiling beneath the veil. The mirror shattered, not from his touch, but from her gaze. Arthur spun around. No one stood behind him, but the pieces on the floor showed her clearly, still veiled, still smiling, still there. She had returned to the manor, not as a ghost confined to the east wing. Now, she moved freely, and with each step she took through Blackthorn's corridors, the past bled into the present. The gaslights flickered on, though no oil fed them. Old portraits changed. Faces melted into blank expressions. Eyes turned black, mouths sewn like the congregation. Mrs. Renfield had vanished. Her teacup sat on the kitchen table, still steaming. Her rosary beads lay snapped across the floor. That night, Arthur tried to leave. The manor gates, once rusted and wide, now stood sealed, iron twisted like vines. The garden paths curved in impossible directions, always leading back to the house. And inside, the halls no longer obeyed the house's shape. Doors opened to brick walls. Staircases bent downward longer than the house should allow. And the east wing was always just behind him. He barricaded himself in the study, lit every candle, sealed the door. But then, he heard it. The soft shuffle of a gown on the hardwood floor. Then the creak of a door slowly swinging open. Not his door. The one behind the fireplace. A hidden passage. He didn't remember it being there. But now, it yawned open, black, damp, lined with dustless stone. At the far end, a faint glow, and the sound of someone breathing. Arthur stepped forward, down into the dark. The passage twisted and sloped until it emptied into a small, circular room, low-ceilinged and lined with mirrors. In the center stood a single object, a mannequin, dressed in the wedding gown. But this time, it wasn't empty. A pale hand rested at its side. A throat moved, and beneath the veil, 2 eyes opened. Not Lillian's, his own. Arthur staggered backward. The mannequin didn't move, but the reflection in the surrounding mirrors did. Each pane of glass showed him in the gown, standing, breathing, watching. His own face veiled. His own hands clasped at the waist. Each reflection blinked out of sync. He looked down at his own body, still dressed in his clothes, still himself. But in the glass, he was already her. The gown, the veil, the hollow eyes. And then one of the reflections stepped forward, from inside the mirror. Its foot struck the stone floor, silent as snowfall. Arthur turned to run, but the passage behind him was gone. Stone sealed the only exit. The mirrors trembled. The reflection raised its hand and pressed it to the surface of the nearest pane. The glass rippled like water. Its lips moved, but the words were not his. He left me, but you stayed. The gown began to twitch on the mannequin. Fabric breathing, something inside it moving. Arthur reached for a candlestick, held it up like a weapon, but the room itself rejected him. The flame died instantly. Cold swept in, so cold it burned. Then came the sound, soft, wet, a second breath. From beneath the mannequin, the base of the stand cracked, and something began to crawl out. First fingers, then arms, clawing the stone. It wasn't Lillian. It wasn't anything human. It wore the same veil, but beneath it was only a black hole, a tunnel of grief and rage that had taken form, and now wanted him to finish what had been denied. The mirrors chanted, 100 authors, whispering the same vow. I do. The veil lifted and wrapped around his shoulders. He screamed, but no sound left his throat. When the chamber opened again at dawn, Arthur was gone. Only the gown remained, draped on the mannequin, veil freshly cleaned, and in the mirrors, he still stood there, waiting, smiling. The study was empty when the villagers arrived. They had come only after the fog lifted, 3 days since the bell last rang. Blackthorn Manor had returned to silence. But it was not the silence of peace. It was the hush of breath held, of something waiting. Inside, the manor looked untouched, clean, dustless. The kind of cleanliness that feels wrong, too deliberate, like something had tried to remember how homes are supposed to look. The portraits were back to normal. The clocks ticked, but none of them kept the right time. The east wing door was locked. No key found. Only a single object had changed in the entire house. In the great hall, beneath the grand chandelier, a mannequin stood, dressed in a wedding gown. The veil shimmered faintly in the morning light. No one knew who put it there, or why the gown smelled faintly of earth. They buried no one. No record showed that Arthur Langley had ever arrived. No luggage. No car. Even Mrs. Renfield's name was absent from the village books. It was as if Blackthorn had swallowed them whole. And deep beneath the manor, in the chamber of mirrors, the glass still held reflections. They flickered sometimes, when no one looked directly. And if you listened closely, ear pressed against cold stone, you could still hear footsteps. Soft, dragging, the slow sound of a train descending toward a station that no longer existed. In the heart of the east wing, behind doors that never stayed locked for long, a room lay sealed in time. A chair still rocked, a veil still drifted, and sometimes, on windless nights, the chapel bell rang. Once, twice, and every mirror in the house went dark. They say the manor was built over limestone caves. Hollow earth, soft stone, easy to carve through. In the oldest parts of the house, behind bricked-over doorways, beneath warped floorboards, there were tunnels, passageways, secret routes servants once used. But some went deeper, too deep, and in those walls, something moved. The new caretaker, a young woman named Eleanor Graves, heard it first. Whispers, just behind the plaster. A low murmur, sometimes a man's voice, always saying the same phrase, "I never left." At first, she thought it was the pipes. Then she heard it in every room, even when no water ran. Then came the knocking. 4 slow taps, always just behind her, always followed by silence. Eleanor tried to leave after a week. She never reached the front gate. By morning, she was back inside. Shoes muddy, eyes hollow, memory gone. She no longer asked questions. She simply began to prepare the manor again. Fresh flowers, clean linen, the table set for 2, as if expecting a guest, or a groom. That night, she found something in the east wing, a set of old bones, sealed behind a crumbling wall. Still dressed in a tattered suit, still clutching a dried bouquet of roses, and nailed to the bricks above the skull, a scrap of parchment. One word, his. The walls began to whisper again, but this time, it wasn't just words. It was breathing, wet, clothes. The mannequin in the great hall had turned, no longer facing the door. Now it looked toward the stairs, waiting. The groom had returned, but he did not walk. He crawled through the hollow spaces between bricks and boards, and he was looking for her. Night fell fast over Blackthorn Manor. Too fast. The sky bled orange only briefly before the darkness swallowed it whole, thick and unnatural. No stars. No moon. Only the house, standing tall, expectant, lit by a light no one had lit. Inside, Eleanor walked the halls in silence. She no longer questioned where she was or why she stayed. She just knew. The wedding gown no longer sat on the mannequin. It floated, trailing along the stairs like mist, draped over nothing, yet moving as if worn. And somewhere in the walls, the groom crawled. Not a man anymore, but not a ghost either. His skin, stretched thin like wax paper, his jaw unhinged, whispering the vow over and over. To have and to hold. To have and to hold. He was close now. So close she could hear his fingernails tapping through the plaster. The widow waited at the altar again. The chapel restored once more, but wrong, too perfect. Every candle burned without flame. Every flower bloomed though no root touched soil. And the pews were full. Not villagers. Not guests. Only memories. Frozen faces. Glassy eyes. Mouths sewn with black thread. They waited. Arthur stood among them. Not aged. Not decayed. Dressed in the groom's suit, unmoving, gaze empty. The veil lifted, and Lillian smiled. "I have waited long enough," she said. "And you, all of you, forgot." She raised her hands, and the walls of the manor shuddered. The corridors collapsed inward. The mirrors cracked. The groom crawled through the chapel floor, bursting from beneath the altar like a corpse clawing through a coffin lid. He screamed, but not in pain, in joy. He had returned. And now, the vow would be finished. Eleanor was pulled forward by invisible hands. Not her own will. Something deeper. Something older. The gown wrapped around her. The veil descended. And Lillian whispered the last words. "Speak now, or stay silent forever." The chapel bell tolled once. A wave of darkness rolled outward from the altar like a final breath. The house swallowed itself, and Blackthorn Manor was no more. Only the field remained, empty, still, until the fog came again, and beneath it, two figures danced, one in white, one in black, forever bound by a vow no one heard, and no one ever should.